Okay, you have two basic watercolor brushes that you can choose from in Corel Painter. You have the digital watercolor brush and the normal watercolor brush. The biggest difference between the two, well, I'll go ahead and show you. First of all, this is where the digital is. I have all my brushes opened up. I always like to have all of them out there. The digital watercolor brush is the one that has the brush icon with the little kind of colored water that's kind of like underneath the brush with a little cup of water. And then the normal watercolor brush, same kind of icon, but the water is clear. Actually, it's kind of a greenish blue color. So to begin with, I'll go ahead and show you what the digital is like. It's kind of similar to watercolor in that it kind of diffuses with the paper, and you have lots to choose from here. So kind of bleeds a little bit, but not that much. I mean, depending on the brush that you're kind of working with, and you can even use like a pure water, like this one is just the pure water one, and it works very similar to how normal watercolor would work. In other words, if you kind of go back to, I'll pick a normal one right here, like the soft broad brush. If we go ahead and kind of work with this like we normally would with watercolor, you can see through it. It's not that opaque at all, and you can also see that when I go into the wet watercolor, it kind of picks it up a little bit. Kind of like oil paint, but obviously it's much more transparent. And then if I increase the opacity, basically it's like adding more watercolor to the water that you're working with. So you're going to be getting much darker marks, but it's still fairly transparent. And you even have little things like a salt that you could kind of paint on there that do a pretty good job of mimicking, like actually sprinkling salt on your watercolor while it's wet. And then you have other brushes to kind of play around with, like the splatter water, which is kind of a nice effect. Whoops! Right now I actually have that on clone, so it's actually cloning something. Occasionally that'll happen, so you just want to make sure anytime it does anything odd like that, just go ahead and backspace. And then you can see that my color wheel is kind of ghosted out. Just go ahead and click that icon again, and then you can see all the colors normally, and then you can work with it like you normally would. And so there's various brushes to kind of work with. And this was just the one that had the pure water again, so it's not doing anything. Actually, it's like taking water, taking pigment away, just like you normally would with a normal watercolor. So that's kind of fun to play around with. The other one, I'm going to go ahead and open up a new document for that. The other one is the normal watercolor brush, and this one actually is much more accurate in terms of how it really mimics a real watercolor. The first thing you want to know about it is once you make a mark, first of all, you can see it really drips in like real time, just like watercolor would. It makes a new watercolor layer, so that's very crucial and important to kind of understand. This can be a very tricky brush to work with. Even though it mimics watercolor really nicely, there's a couple things you really need to know about it. Isn't that awesome? It actually kind of bleeds down there. So it's really fun to work with, but it does open up a new watercolor layer automatically. And the biggest thing you need to know about this is, let's say if I do some watercolor here, I grab all sorts of funky brushes and kind of go to town. The first thing you need to know is, like, let's say if I want to put some pastel on top of that, I pick my pastel, try to work on it, and it won't let me. The only thing that you can paint with on a watercolor layer, a traditional watercolor layer, this isn't the case with the digital, you can work on anything you want to there, is the actual watercolor. So I have to either continue to work with the watercolor, or if I want to draw on top of this with pastel, I need to open up a new layer, and then I can actually work with the pastel on top of it. I'll pick a color you can actually see. So then I can actually kind of work on top of it. But this really is a fun brush to play around with. Let's go back to the watercolor brush. The ones that I really like the most are the ones that really do a good job of mimicking watercolor, are the runny ones, like the runny wash flat, which is the one that I was using. I'll go ahead and work with black so you can kind of really see what's going on, and I'll put the opacity to 38 or so. Do a couple backspaces, and you can see that it really mimics it really well. It actually starts to bleed down just like a normal watercolor would. Now, if you really want to get a little more control over your watercolor brush, what you're going to want to do is go to Window, go to Brush Controls, and go to Show Water, and that's going to open up this little watercolor menu here. And here you can really start to tweak it. I admit I'm still getting used to it. It's a little confusing to me. But you can do things like adjust the wetness of it. So if I take wetness all the way down, and let's say I'm working with this bright red color, and I'm working with a runny wash flat, and I make a mark here, it's really not going to move whatsoever. And then if I kind of increase wetness all the way up, and it starts to kind of bleed and stuff. You can also play around with the dry rate, the pickup, like how absorbent the paper is. The diffuse amount, which is another thing that's kind of fun to play around with. So if I take diffuse like all the way down, granted I have the wetness all the way up, but it's not really diffusing that much. It's just kind of staying exactly where you actually put the brush stroke. And if I increase diffuse up a little bit and have wetness there, then it really starts to kind of drip all over the place. There we go. And you can see it's also affecting the other brush stroke that I made. It's still kind of taking me a while to get used to it. Another really fun thing is you notice that you have this little circle right here with an arrow going down. Right now I have it so you have the wind direction, basically the flow of the paint going down. If you wanted to, and you can actually do this midway through your drip. What I mean by that is right here you have like a little icon that actually shows the paint dripping down. If you wanted to, you could make this arrow go here, and then all of a sudden the direction of the flow starts to move in this direction. I'll go ahead and show you. And you can see it moves pretty slow here. This is a pretty complicated brush. And once it starts to drip, there you can see it's actually starting to go in this direction now. Now you can see how slow this works. You can also see some really cool effects when you actually start paint on top of watercolor layers. It's a pretty intense brush. It takes up a lot of memory. One thing that I would watch out for is try to have some programs closed when you're working with it. I would also encourage you to use a pretty small brush. If you're working with like an absolutely massive brush and you work with watercolor, chances are it's going to either take forever or it's going to lock up Painter and you're going to have to restart it. A couple of other things that you can do is you can notice it's still wet by how it's dripping here. If you want it to totally dry, what you can do is go to the layer menu here and go all the way down here and dry watercolor layer. And then it'll be dry. You can see it beginning to drip. Whoop, looks like it's freezing up a little bit. It's not dripping anymore, and then you can work on top of it and it's going to be totally dry. Another thing that you can do is if you want to work wet on wet again, then you can wet the entire watercolor layer, and then these are wet again, and then you can actually, if you wanted to draw on top of them or paint on top of them with other colors, it'll actually, bleed with the other colors.